classed as white British for us. This is a variety of British racism that I think is largely obsolete and probably never came through very actively in practical politics. But it's quite a noticeable feature of British intellectual life between, roughly speaking, the middle of the 19th century and the middle of the 20th. You've got a couple of examples on the handout. You've got the racial map of the British Islands based on research done by John Beddoe, that is what the races of Britain. He was the inventor of the index of brunetteness, or also called the index of negrescence. He went around Britain and Ireland measuring the hair color of the people he encountered. He made sure not to include people who he thought were over 40 because they might be turning gray. He also didn't include anybody who he thought might be of the upper classes because they'd be likely to be more mobile. But people who he encountered who he thought were of the working classes, he wrote down according to his system what color hair they had and averaged it up to produce tables and maps like this, showing, broadly speaking, darker hair to the west and lighter hair to the east. And this is based on thousands. It says on the, it's based on more than 13,000 observations that he'd made on his travel. This was an influential book. He didn't just look at hair. But this was an influential book. A lot of people took it seriously, and ideas from it come out, or from Beddoe and from other writers of this school, come out quite widely in discussions at that time of British society, British life. And so we might ask ourselves why. What are the origins? What was the appeal? And you've also got, I'll be talking in more detail later on, the bit of text from Henry Jenner. You can see examples in that. The working class of the Midlands, as you see in lines 10 and following, are descended from the Paleolithic caveman and have far less in common with any white man than they have with, we would now say, Khoisan, Inuit, Sami, or indigenous Australians. Now, the reference there to the Paleolithic caveman is a bit of a pointer to where some of this comes from. And to understand it, I think we need to look a little bit at the history of archaeology and the history of linguistics. And in both of those fields, we see something that I think is a major factor of 19th century Western European, including British, intellectual culture, which is the enormous extension backwards into the past of known or knowable time. Part of that is to do with geology, getting a clearer idea of the physical age of the earth. But as regards human societies as well, you have several converging strands. You have the decipherment of ancient languages, decipherment of Egyptian by Champollion in 1822, or that's the date that's given. And following that, other ancient languages, which in due course pushed back written history about as far again for certain parts of the world. Prior to 1822, the oldest reliable written sources for history were biblical or Greek, and for China, classical Chinese. And it fades out into legend somewhere between 500 BCE and 1000 BCE. Whereas with Egyptian sources, Mesopotamian sources, as they become available, you can push back into the 2000s BCE, establish a chronology, establish the political and religious history. None of that is possible for the British Isles because there are not pre-Rome written sources. But at very much the same time, C.J. Thomson in Denmark was placing the idea of Stone Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age on a scientific and rational foundation. He was a museum curator in Denmark, and people had already speculated. The idea of Iron Age and Bronze Age at least goes back to the Iron Age. Greek poet Hesiod knows full well that he is in the Iron Age when edged implements are made out of iron. And he knows from traditional stories that in earlier times people fought with swords made of bronze rather than iron. He then generalized, well, what came before the Bronze Age? It was probably a Silver Age, and before that was a Golden Age. So the idea that different technologies succeed one another was not new in the 19th century. But the idea that you could establish a relative chronology by seeing what kind of objects, what kind of burials are found together with each other, and establish at least relative dating. This is earlier than that. This burial is a Bronze Age burial, and this one is a burial of the New Stone Age, the Neolithic, or this is Iron Age. That was originated in the 19th century, early 19th century. So you have this vast expanse of time when different kinds of burial mounds in the British countryside. I thought, oh, you know, sometimes it's a long barrow like that, and sometimes it's a round barrow. And there's not much more you can say about it. But with the beginnings of a scientific archaeology, you can say that the long barrows are of the Neolithic. You might not be able quite, and this is long before carbon date, you might not be able to put a figure on it in years, but you can say this is the Neolithic, the period when tools were made out of polished stone. Whereas the round barrows come from the Bronze Age, from a substantially later historical period. So you can start thinking, well, we're getting a history of the British Isles that goes back far earlier than what was known before. But then what do you do with it? Once you've excavated your Stone Age and your Bronze Age burials, you still don't, the political history isn't recoverable. The religious history is only to a very limited extent recoverable, because you can only find physical objects that are in the ground. But one thing you can do if you've got burials is measure the skeletons, and in particular measure the skulls. The technique here was originated by a Swedish anatomist, Anders Retzius, in the 1830s and 1840s. And it goes on to be used, it becomes a centerpiece of ethnology and race science, or scientific races. The idea that you can categorize people based on the shapes of their skulls. Retzius originated it to categorize prehistoric burials. To say, well, we can't tell very much about these people, but at least we can tell what shape their heads were. He invented the cephalic index, which is now used to describe different breeds of dogs and cats. But in his time, the cephalic index was used in prehistory and in ethnology and racist science more broadly. The cephalic index is simply the ratio between the width of the skull left to right and the length of it front to back. And it turns out that you can have a narrower and longer skull, which Retzi has called dolichocephalic, long-headed. Or you can have a comparatively short and round skull where it's wider than that. And he called that brachycephalic, broad. And it turns out that in British prehistory, the Neolithic burials of the late Stone Age polished stone tool using peoples, you find burials with narrow and long heads, dolichocephalic. Whereas in the Bronze Age, you find round, broad heads, brachycephalic, leading to the aphorism, which was coined by Thurnham, one of the authors of a classic book, Crania Britannica, British Skulls. Long barrow, long skull, round barrow, round skull. So here we're finding out something. We're not just finding dry objects in the ground, but we're discovering race. We're discovering movements of peoples that in the Bronze Age a different race came in. And once you've done that, you can then say, well, and who now is descended from? Let's start measuring skulls. And we can find out who's got that long skull that means that they've been here since the Neolithic, and who's got the round skull that might mean they came in with bronze metallurgy. And wherever he could, John Beddoe, as well as looking at hair color and eye color, wherever he could, he also measured skull. He didn't manage to get as many skull measurements as he did. Partly, you don't need to ask somebody if you're writing down their hair color. Whereas having your skull measured was uncomfortable and bothersome, and people largely did not volunteer to do it. Beddoe invented a trick to try to encourage them to do it, that he and his colleagues would stand at a street corner and pretend to get into an argument about who's got a bigger head or the different shapes of each other's heads. And then right then, get out the calipers, right, we're going to settle this, in the hope that passers-by would get drawn in and say, oh yeah, do me as well. And perhaps sometimes that worked and he did get skull measurements and was able to correlate them directly. Otherwise, he made do with the index of nigrescence and with other kinds of information. And in the races of Britain, he identifies lots of different racial groups that he believes still exist in the British Isles, including an Iberian race, we'll have to come back to Iberian, an Africanoid race, a Mongoliform race, and any number of others. And he tries where he can to correlate them with prehistoric skulls published in Crania Britannica and elsewhere, and to establish which of these groups is descended from, who's descended from the Romans, who's descended from the long barrows, and so on. So that's the contribution of archaeology, as it were, to the emergence of this variety of British races. And there's also some contribution made by linguistics, which is another science that's developing at exactly the same time and is also promising to push back knowledge deep into the prehistoric past. And this is specifically Indo-European linguistics. The discovery that many languages of India and many languages of Europe are strikingly similar was not. And had been famously pointed out in the 18th century by Sir William Jones, comparing Sanskrit with Latin and Greek. And he was able to say on the basis of that, that it's quite impossible that similarities could have come about by chance. These languages must all be descended from a common ancestor that perhaps no longer exists. But that insight began to be developed, above all by Franz Bopp, German linguist in the 1810s, 20s, 30s, who published a series of works on the comparative grammar of Sanskrit and European languages, also bringing in some others, and to establish regular patterns. The way this works, you can imagine, and we know that certain languages in modern Europe are all descended from Latin, like French, Italian, Spanish, Romanian, Portuguese, are all descended from Latin. And up to a point, we know historically how that happened. We know that these were provinces of the Roman Empire. But although not every province of the Roman Empire ended up speaking a form of Latin, but some did. And if you look at those languages, even if Latin had been lost, even if the Romans had not had writing, so there was no written evidence for that, you would be able to look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, and identify that these are variations on a theme, that these look as though they've descended from a common ancestor. And you might then be able to identify regular patterns, not just, oh, that sounds similar to that, but wherever we see a particular sound in this language, we see a different sound in the other language. And then you can start to reconstruct what was the hypothetical ancestor. Look, from that pattern of relationships, you could reconstruct a proto-Romance and have some idea of what the language of the Romans might have been like. And Bopp began to do that with Proto-Indo-European. The word Indo-European was first used in print, I think, in 1813. The Indo-European language family includes not every language of Europe, but most. It doesn't include Basque in the north of Spain and south of France. It doesn't include languages of the Uralic group, like Finnish, Estonian, Sami, Hungarian, and a lot of languages of Russia. But it does include most of the languages. Similarly, it doesn't include all the languages of India. It doesn't include Tamil. It doesn't include Malayalam, and many others. But languages spoken by large numbers of people in the Indian subcontinent, like Hindi or Urdu, Punjabi, do turn out to be related to many of the European languages. And also to some languages like Armenian, Persian, that are spoken, strictly speaking, neither in India nor in Europe. And if you're already thinking in racial terms, once this is being discovered and we're reconstructing the Proto-Indo-European language, well, who spoke it? Who were the Proto-Indo-Europeans? Was there a Proto-Indo-European race that then conquered and settled all these other places and brought their language. In the same way that the Romans conquered and settled Gaul and Dacia, and those are now France and Romania, and they are Latin-speaking countries. Were there Proto-Indo-Europeans, and who were they and when? What can we find out for that? Another word for Indo-European in 19th century scholarship was Aryan, which originates as a self-designation, certainly used in ancient India. Speakers of Sanskrit referred to themselves as Aryan. Also in ancient Iran, the name Iran is derived from Old Persian Ivyanam, related to Aryan. It was widely suggested in the 19th century that Ireland or Era was from the same root. That etymology is no longer regarded as reliable. But Aryan was used as a synonym for Indo-European or as a name for the people who spoke, a name for the Indo-European people or the Indo-European race. And this would be understood very much in terms of a conquest model, like Latin resulting from the Rome or Romance languages derived from Latin, coming from the Roman conquests. So the modern Indo-European languages might have originated from Aryan conquests in prehistory. And so then let's look back at the skulls and see, when did the Aryans arrive and which races were here before the Aryans? Which races are here before the Aryans? A couple of different hypotheses were put forward. Probably the idea that got the biggest celebrity was the idea that it would have been speakers of something like Sami or Finnish, a language of the Uralic family, as we would now call it. This was promoted by David McRitchie. He's probably now best remembered for a book called The Testimony of Tradition, where he argued that the fairies and elves and goblins and pixies of mythology are a folk recollection of pre-Aryan race. And that they've become a bit magical in the retelling. I think somebody else summarizing McRitchie's work said that our fairy tales are Iron Age stories about Bronze Age people fighting against Stone Age. So the idea is that these are the first Aryan conquerors, and they meet the pre-Aryans and subjugate them. And they remember those pre-Aryan as those funny little people who live out in the woods and the hills and might have an association with prehistoric barrows and mounds, fairy hills, and so on. And he thought those pre-Aryans would have been Uralic speakers. Surely he can't, you might think, associate the Fenian cycle of Irish legend or mythology. Surely he can't say that Fenian is a form of the word Finnish. He can, does. He suggests that the English word sir is of Uralic origin. He says Vogel, which we would say Mansi, a language of Western Siberia, belonging to the Uralic family. He says Sorni is a Mansi word meaning white. So when you say to your social superior, sir, yes, sir, no, sir, you are placing yourself in the position, at least, of your ancestor, the subjugated pre-Aryan, indigenous, Mansi-speaking native of these islands, saying yes, white man, no white man. In fact, Sorni in Mansi means gold. And Sir has a perfectly adequate etymology. It comes via French. It's related to senior. The French monsieur, the sire for the king. Senior becomes seigneur, seigeur, seer. So that's probably more plausible, really, than picking a word that has some sort of meaning and has an S and an R in it from a Mansi dictionary. But I mean, credit to him for having broad intellectual horizons. That's in a different book. That's in Ancient and Modern Britain. That's what he talks about. Yes, white man. So for him, the idea might be that the indigenous pre-Aryan population of Britain were, as I say, Finnish, or they were something like the Finns or the Hungarians or the Sami or the Mansi, or those other people. The other hypothesis that gets raised is, and this one you still hear echoes of, although not as a majority opinion in literature today, is that the pre-Indo-European language of the British Isles would have been something like Semitic, would have been part of the language family that we now call Afro-Asiatic, which includes Semitic languages like Arabic, and also quite a large number of languages spoken in the northern third of Africa, like Somali, Hausa in northern Nigeria. Ancient Egyptian is a member of the Afro-Asiatic family. The Berber or Amazigh languages of North Africa. Why did people think that the pre-Indo-European language of the British Isles might be Afro-Asiatic? This is based on purely linguistic arguments, although not ones that are completely compelling. The Celtic languages of the British Isles, accepting for the sake of argument Celtic as a purely linguistic bracket that includes languages derived from Old Irish, which is modern Irish, Gaelic, and Manx, languages derived from British, language that would have been spoken in the British Isles when the Romans arrived, which is Welsh, Breton, and Cornish. And also historically, we can group in with these some languages that were spoken on the continent, like Gaulish, and others further afield. And this is a well-established branch within Indo-European comparisons. But then it turns out that the Celtic languages of the British Isles, which are the only ones that have survived to be spoken as modern languages today. But we do have some inscriptions in Gaulish and in other Celtic languages, so we have some ideas. But the insular Celtic languages are structurally and syntactically very unusual within the Indo-European family. For example, they have a verb-first word, that rather than having a subject-object verb, you would say, Johnny eats apples, or Ed keeps going on about race theory, or whatever else it might be, subject, verb, object. In insular Celtic languages, the verb comes first. So you would say eats Johnny apples, or that other slanderous one. They also have an unusual way of doing chains of possessives, where you have the something of the somebody, or whatever it might be, which is that only the last one, like the the head of the man. It's not a very imaginative example. Only the last one can be definite, can have the article the. In Welsh or Irish, you would have to say the equivalent of head the man, but you can't say the head of the man. The word for the is not allowed. And if it were the cephalic index of the head of the man, then it would have to be cephalic index head the man. But you can only have one definite, which comes at the end. And you see this somewhat in like Plaid Cymru. Cymru is the name Wales. It's the party of Wales, but that first the does not appear in Welsh and would not be correct in Welsh. So, okay, we've established that these are fairly unusual characteristics that Irish and Welsh and those languages share. Gaulish doesn't. Celtic languages on the continent don't have these characteristics, and other Indo-European languages. So where do we find languages that do? Well, Arabic does, for example. If you're thinking of Plaid Cymru, you might also be familiar with Hezbollah, but also the party of God. And you don't say the party, you just say party of God. Only the last one can have the definite article. So Hezbollah, Plaid Cymru. The words Hes and Plaid are obviously not related, but the syntax is the same. So the suggestion was made that perhaps before Indo-European Celtic is a branch of Indo-European, before the Indo-European Celts arrived, the British Isles were inhabited by people speaking languages, something like Arabic. And the Celtic languages that we know of in the British Isles, Welsh and Irish and so on, are the result of learning the Celtic vocabulary, but speaking it almost like a Creole, still with more of the syntax of the underlying language. As I say, this is not generally regarded as a compelling argument, partly because purely syntactic comparisons are not normally taken to prove very much in this sort of linguistics, because after all, there only are so many possibilities. If you're going to have a subject, a verb, and an object, there only are so many possible orders you can put them in. So proving a historical relationship on the basis of that, without any links of vocabulary, is probably an uphill struggle. But in the later 19th century, it was taken seriously, and you can point to, the fact that megalithic monuments like stone circles are found along the Atlantic seaboard from Morocco up through Spain, France, British Isles, and into southern Scandinavia. Look, these are the monuments of that Atlantic speaking. The word Atlantic is sometimes used as a name for the Semitic languages that would have been spoken in the British Isles and along the Atlantic coast. And of course, some people might have said both. You might have had Uralic speaking, you might have had the Uralic speaking natives, and then maybe the Bronze Age could have been speaking Atlantic. And then when the Iron Age came in, that was the Indo-Europeans, that was the Aryan race. Incidentally, thinking of the Uralic parallel, those of you who are readers, I don't know whether any of you are, those of you who are readers of Tolkien, might think that this discussion of the old races who were here before we were starts sounding a bit Lord of the Rings, a bit elvish. Tolkien went to great effort to construct languages for his elves. There are two principal elvish languages. that Tolkien constructed. One that is the most classic old high version of Elvish, which is called Quenya. And there's a slightly less, still respectable, but a slightly less. Sindering. Sindering is very visibly modelled on Welsh. Has a similar sound system, similar sound pattern. If you look at Sindering names, you think, oh yeah, that sounds like Welsh. The senior language of the men of Britain. Some Tolkien described Welsh as the senior language of the men. But then what's the other, the more high classy, the even before Welsh? Well, Quenya is modelled on Finnish. There may be other reasons. Tolkien was an admirer of the Kalevala, the Finnish epic poem put together out of bits of oral tradition in the 19th century by Elias Lemon. But nonetheless, it's at least evocative of some of these themes. So once these ideas are there coming out of, as I suggested, archaeology and linguistics, and mixing to form a kind of ethnology or a kind of race science, it's then tempting to apply it to the present day, and say, look, well, which of the races of antiquity are still living in Britain now? How does it match up with hair color? How does it match up with skull shape? Who in Britain is really an Aryan and who is actually the subjugated native population? And as an example of that, you have on the handout, and if anybody doesn't have the handout, do yell. You have on the handout an excerpt from Henry Jenner. I've given you this not because Henry Jenner is uniquely important, but this is a very clear demonstration of what I'm talking about, rather than pulling together bits of quotes from here and there. Jenner, well, you can see that this comes from a handbook of the Cornish language. Cornish, which had ceased to be a spoken language around the end of the 18th century. Jenner was Cornish himself, and he was interested in getting together what could be known of Cornish from manuscript documents written in it, and possibly even reviving it as a written language. He wrote some verses in Cornish, reviving it as a written language and possibly even as a spoken language. And the modern Cornish language revived. There are people who attempt to write and speak revived forms of Cornish. That really goes back to Henry Jenner. So he is of importance for that world. The revived Cornish that exists today is not exactly the same as you'll find in Jenner's book, because if you're reviving an extinct language, you have a lot of choices. There's something like 1,000 years worth of written Cornish, never very copious in any one period. We have to decide, are we fixing on one? Are we saying we're aiming for the Tudor standard of the language? Or we're aiming for the very latest 18th century? Or are we aiming for medieval? And then there are no standardized spellings in the documents. So you have to decide on spellings. You have to decide what you're going to do about words that undoubtedly existed in the language, but doesn't either never happened to be written down, or the documents where they were written down don't happen to have survived. So there are gaps in the vocabulary that you have to come up with ways of filling. And to a certain extent, you can have different approaches of principle. You can say, wherever there's a gap in the vocabulary, we'll go to Breton, which is the closest living relative. And if there's a Breton word that we can use, then we'll fit that in. But to a certain extent, it also just comes down to aesthetic preferences or what you think makes a plausible seeming language, or one that's easy to learn or easy to use, or whatever else it might be. So not exactly the same as, so modern revived Cornish, it's not exactly the same as Jenner's version. But I think everybody involved with Cornish language revival would acknowledge Jenner as a seminal figure. He also had political convictions. If you can't discover them from looking at the passage, at the time he wrote this, he was a paid-up member of a Jacobite organization, but purportedly aiming to restore the deposed Stuart dynasty. This was not in the early 20th century a practical political program, but it probably allowed an expression of extreme romantic conservative royals, combined with some degree of sympathy for Scottish and Irish national aspirations. So for Henry Jenner, very proud Celt and Cornishman, and somebody of robustly right-wing views, to a certain extent, the League of the White Rose, I think it was called, was a natural fit. And in this passage, he's arguing for Celtic pride, Cornish pride, in terms of the race theory or ethnological theory that's been developed through the processes that I've talked about. So he's saying that the Celtic speak, or the people who within living memory might have spoken, or within historical memory might have spoken Celtic, the Cornish, the Highlanders, the Welsh, are the true Aryan. Whereas most of the people who regard themselves as English are those Mansi-speaking natives who were conquered and said, yes, white man. And they now think of themselves as being English. They speak English, which is an Indo-European language, or in his terms, an Aryan language. But if you look at the index of Negrescence, or if you look at their skull shapes, or look at whatever else you might want to look at, you can say, oh, they're not. Most of the English are not really Aryan. They're not really white. Which he says in here, the natives of what are known as the Celtic parts of these islands are more purely Aryan. This is lines 32 and following in the handout. More purely Aryan than any except the upper and upper middle class of England. So the upper and upper middle classes are Aryan, and perhaps workers are Aryan in a few places that he picks out. Cornwall, the Highlands. Wales, he's not quite certain. A certain Silurian or Iberian element in South Wales, which descends from the higher or fighting sort of Pre-Indo-European. So they're not the absolute natives of the rest of the island, but they are a pre-Indo-European conqueror. Silurian, the Silures were the tribal group in South Wales in Rome, presumably pre-Rome. Tacitus in the Agricola. Tacitus had never been to Britain, but he'd heard from people who had that the Silures, people of what's now South Wales, were darker in complexion and had darker hair than the other Britons. And they looked like the Spanish, they looked like the Iberians. So perhaps they're a colony from Spain. And that I mentioned when I was a whistle-stop tour of non-Indo-European languages in Europe. I mentioned bats. So these bats, that's a surviving non-Indo-European language. Very probably the Silures of South Wales were a colony from Iberia, and they'd have been Basque speakers. Then you might look across the sea to Ireland. And remember that in a work of the Middle Ages, the Book of the Invasions of Ireland, which talks about various mythological races that invaded Ireland. One of them was the tribe of the gods Tuatha notice with no the at the beginning because it's Celtic syntax, tribe of the gods Tuatha. And then after that, Ireland was conquered by the Milesian, who are represented as being colonists from Spain. Their leader, after whom their name is Mil Espain, Mil from Spain or of Spain. Things out, well, later on you see the South Wales and Ireland. They've probably got a big Iberian Silurian Basque. But other than that, the other Celtic areas, now Highlands definitely, Cornwall definitely, those are Aryan, even workers there are white. But in the Midlands, for example, they're not. They're descended from the Paleolithic caveman. They're the natives who've been there all the time, and they've just been successively conquered by different races. And when he's talking about who they resemble, this is line 11, line 12, well, they have far less in common with the Anglo-Saxon, the Celt, or any other white man than they have with these other peoples, the Khoisan, the Inuit, the Sami, or Australians. Well, Sami, that's linking up directly. That's the Uralic. We've seen that as we've seen Sami as a prototypical pre-Aryan native European. All those others are peoples living in British settler colonies of the time. Khoisan at the Cape, the Inuit in Canada, and Australians in Australia. And when he talks about his picture of wars between different groups of white Aryans, Celts and the Saxons and the Normans and so on, fighting over which of them will rule the natives. There's only a couple of years after the war. And I think even without the mention of the Khoisan from South Africa, that parallel would have struck people at the time, that he's presenting a British history as though it is just like a British settler colony, where the mass of the population, the indigenous population, are passive objects of the ambitions of different rival groups of conquerors. And that's why the defeated Celt flees to the west, to Cornwall and Wales, whereas the really British indigenous native population just get on with it under a new set of masters to whom they can say, yes, sorry. So what we've got here is treating the British present in exactly the same manner of thinking, exactly the same racial style of thought that would have been applied in British colonies. This is an experience of the empire, and pretty explicitly in Jenner, that most of the working class are are not white, they're not Aryan, they're not ruling peoples like the upper and upper middle classes. Suspect he was of the upper middle classes himself, otherwise why extend the colour line that low? And it might purely be to line up with his pro-Celtic attitude, that the places that he includes, other than Cornwall, Wales, he mentions Devon, Somerset. Well, plausibly you can say these have, he's just interested in those because they had more of a Celtic heritage in the distant past, it might be. But I wonder whether it's also, you know, for somebody of his politics, it's very convenient to be able to say that if the workers are Aryans and therefore presumably deserving of some kind of political rights or consideration, so if the workers are Aryans anywhere, then it's in non-industrial regions. The Midlands, very industrialized, they're cavemen. They need to be conquered and held down. In South Wales, industrial, so even though it's Celtic, it does have those higher or fighting sort of non-Aryans. Devon and Somerset, not very industrial, but they can be the Shire in terms of Tolkien. So what we've got here is a naturalization of social hierarchy, using terminology and ideas that derive from these different branches of learning, from archaeology, from linguistics, and elsewhere, and incorporating the current political situation. The workers in the Midlands, we don't like them, need to keep them down. Also including the situation in settler colonies elsewhere, modeling Britain on one of its settler colonies, and saying that it's only really the upper and upper middle classes who can be counted as the conquerors, the settlers of this settler colony. Most of the population are the non-white natives, and they need to be studied ethnologically, and they need to be kept in check. And all of that is exactly what you would find in one of those British settler colonies. You know, this is very much the way we would now find more familiar varieties of British racism work. This really isn't that different. And I don't think it's a difference that you might be tempted to think, but these differences are imagined. The difference between the workers of Somerset and the workers of the Midlands are imaginary differences. But do we think racial differences are not in general imaginary? And in fact, differences in the shape of the skull. We are not now used to people using skull shape as a yardstick, or even hair color. But those are perfectly visible. Those are perfectly visible criteria. So I really don't think this is that different from other varieties of racism that still persist today. And that maybe is part of the reason why I've wasted your time with it this afternoon, is because it might provide some insight or some helpful pointers on how other varieties of British racism have come to be and how they function. It's also, I've mentioned with Tolkien, there are lots of traces of this sort of thinking that you'll find in literature of the period. If you want the unspeakably primitive fairy goblin natives, Arthur Machen, writer of the very end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, has lots of stories that go along with that. Grant Allen's story, Pallinghurst Barrow, is a sort of supernatural, I mean, it's got fairies, but it's also a sort of a kind of race fable, which a lot of Grant Allen's fiction is. And there are many other examples. But I think that's a reasonable point. I think that draws some of the strands back together again. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
I think comrades. Oh, I've seen 1, 2, 3,